The dust swirled in lazy eddies around the broken wagon wheel, a gritty testament to the settler's misfortune. Elias Thorne slumped on a rock, the brim of his sweat-stained hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but not enough to hide the deep lines of exhaustion and despair etched around his eyes and mouth. His journey west, once a vessel of fragile hope, had splintered here, on the unforgiving edge of a fledgling town named Redemption Creek. The axle was fractured, a jagged wound in the sturdy oak, and one of the iron-banded wheels lay canted at an impossible angle, like a fallen soldier. His meager supplies, all that remained of a life he'd left behind, were now vulnerable under the vast, indifferent sky. He'd cursed, he'd prayed, he'd even kicked the stubborn wheel until his boot smarted and his spirit sagged further. Now, a heavy silence pressed in, broken only by the buzz of unseen insects and the distant, mournful call of a hawk. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made him glance up, his hand instinctively going to the worn butt of the pistol tucked into his belt. It was just a child, a girl no older than 10, emerging from the tall grasses that fringed the dirt track leading to the town. She was small for her age, dressed in a faded calico dress that had seen better days, her bare feet dusty. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached straw, was pulled back in a simple braid, and her eyes, a startling shade of blue, were fixed on his broken wagon with an unnerving intensity. There was a quietness about her, an old soul quality that seemed out of place in one so young. She carried a small, woven pouch at her side, and her steps were light, almost hesitant, as she approached. Elias grunted, a sound of pure frustration. "Nothing to see here, girl." Just a man at the end of his rope. His voice was hoarse, laced with a bitterness that tasted like ash in his mouth. He didn't mean to be unkind, but his patience had long since evaporated under the relentless sun. The girl stopped a respectful distance away, her gaze unwavering. "The axle looks bad," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and steady, without a trace of childish lilt. "And the linchpin's likely sheared clean off, or bent till it's useless." Elias stared. Most children her age would be skittish, or giggling, or simply incurious. This one spoke with the calm assurance of a seasoned wheelwright. He almost laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "And what would you know about axles and linchpins, little miss?" he asked, a weary sarcasm coloring his tone. "Best run along. There's naught here for you." She didn't flinch from his gruffness. Instead, her eyes, clear and disconcertingly perceptive, scanned the wreckage more closely. "My pa, he taught me things," she said softly, a fleeting shadow of sadness crossing her face. "About wagons. About how things fit together. Sometimes, even when they look all broken, they just need a careful hand." She took another step closer, her gaze still on the damaged axle. Maybe I could look." Elias felt a surge of irritation. The audacity! A slip of a girl, offering to meddle where he, a grown man, had failed. "Look," he began, his voice rising, "I appreciate the sentiment, or whatever it is, but this ain't child's play. This here is my whole life spilled out on the dirt. I need a blacksmith, not a curious child." He waved a dismissive hand. "Go on now. Your ma will be wondering where you are." The girl's shoulders drooped slightly, but her gaze didn't waver from the wagon. "My ma's gone," she said, the words simple, devoid of self-pity, yet they hung in the air with a quiet weight. "And the blacksmith, Mr. Grumbles, he's laid up with the fever. His boy tries, but he's not got the knack for the heavy work yet." She paused, then, with a courage that surprised him, she added, "I might see something you've missed. Sometimes a different pair of eyes helps." Elias was about to retort, to tell her firmly to leave him to his misery, but something in her earnest gaze, in the quiet dignity of her small frame, gave him pause. He was tired, so bone-weary that the world seemed to tilt and sway if he stood too quickly. What did he have to lose? A few more minutes of wasted time? His situation could hardly get worse. He sighed, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry away the last of his resistance. "Fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Fine. Look all you want. Just don't get in the way." He turned his back, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, already regretting his reluctant permission, bracing himself for the inevitable failure and the hollow "I told you so" that would echo in his own mind. He didn't expect anything, least of all help from such an unlikely source. The sun beat down, and the silence returned, now filled with the almost imperceptible sounds of the girl moving around the crippled wagon. The little girl, whose name was Elara, moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her years. She didn't touch anything at first, simply circled the damaged wheel and axle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her gaze was methodical, taking in the splintered wood, the angle of the brake, the way the heavy wagon bed sagged precariously. Elias, despite himself, found his attention drawn back to her. He'd expected her to poke aimlessly, perhaps offer some childishly impractical suggestion. Instead, she knelt, her small fingers gently probing the jagged edges of the fractured axle, her touch surprisingly delicate. "The main brake is bad," she murmured, almost to herself, "but it's not just that. See here?" She pointed to a spot near where the axle entered the wheel hub, a place Elias had cursed at but hadn't truly examined with such focused intent. "The wood is stressed, and this iron band, it's slipped. It was probably loose for a while. Made the axle weak right at this point. The jolt that broke it just finished what was already starting." Elias grunted, non-committal, but he leaned closer, peering at the spot she indicated. She was right. He'd been so focused on the dramatic snap, he hadn't considered the contributing factors. A slow, grudging respect began to kindle within him. Elara then turned her attention to the linchpin, or what was left of it. As she'd predicted, it was horribly bent, almost sheared. This wouldn't have held much longer anyway, she stated. She opened the small woven pouch she carried and, to Elias's surprise, drew out a few surprisingly sturdy-looking tools, a small, sharp awl, a piece of tightly wound cord, and a flat, smooth stone. Not blacksmith's tools, but useful things, carefully kept. "If we could brace the axle," she mused, her eye scanning the surrounding area, then back to the wagon. "And if we had a new pin, or something that could act like one, just to get you to town." Elias snorted. "If wishes were horses, little miss. There's no spare axle here, and the nearest timber sturdy enough is miles away. As for a pin, it needs to be strong." Elara nodded, unfazed. "There's a seasoned branch of ironwood I saw by the creek crossing, about a quarter-mile back," she said. "Thick as my wrist. If it could be shaped. And for the brace." Her eyes lit on a spare plank of wood tied beneath the wagon bed, one Elias had forgotten he even had. "That might do. If we can wedge it tight." Without waiting for his approval, she set about her task with a quiet determination. She showed Elias how to use his own heavier axe to carefully trim and shape the ironwood branch she directed him to retrieve, her instructions precise. She explained how the grain needed to run, how to avoid splitting it. He found himself obeying, a strange sense of unreality washing over him as he worked under the direction of this small child. Her hands, though tiny, were nimble and surprisingly strong as she used the awl to clean out the damaged hole for the linchpin, and then, with Elias's help providing the brute force, they managed to leverage the spare plank into place, creating a crude but surprisingly effective splint for the fractured axle. The most difficult part was crafting a new linchpin from the ironwood. It took time, with Elara patiently showing Elias how to shave it down with his knife, using her smooth stone to burnish it. It wasn't perfect, not like forged iron, but it was solid. As they worked, a fragile camaraderie began to form. He learned her name, Elara, and she spoke a little more about her father, a wanderer and mender of things, who had taught her to see the world in terms of how it worked, and how it could be fixed. Finally, with a great deal of grunting and careful maneuvering, they managed to reseat the wheel and slide the makeshift ironwood pin into place. It held. The wagon stood, if not perfectly, then at least upright and seemingly capable of slow movement. Elias stared at it, then at Elara, a sense of profound disbelief washing over him. This child, this tiny, quiet girl had done what he, in his despair, had deemed impossible. As Elara wiped a smudge of grime from her cheek with the back of her hand, the late afternoon sun caught something on her finger. A ring. It was an incongruous sight on such a small, work-stained hand, an old, silver ring, intricately carved with a pattern of what looked like intertwined vines and a single, small, deep blue stone, almost black in the fading light. It was clearly old, and of a quality far removed from her simple dress and bare feet. "That's quite a ring you have there, Elara," Elias said, his voice softer now, touched with a genuine curiosity that surprised even himself. The immediate crisis of the wagon was over, and this small, glinting object seemed to suddenly command his attention. Elara looked down at her hand, a shy smile gracing her lips for the first time. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice holding a note of reverence. "It's all I have left of her." She said it was very old, from her family, a long way back. She turned her hand, letting the light play over the carvings. "She told me to always keep it safe." Elias leaned closer, a strange prickling sensation running down his spine. The design, there was something hauntingly familiar about those intertwined vines, about the deep, almost luminous quality of that tiny blue stone. His mind, sluggish from heat and despair just moments before, now raced, trying to place the image that flickered at the edge of his memory. He'd seen a ring like that before, or one remarkably similar. But where? When? The feeling was insistent, a hook snagging on a forgotten memory. He frowned, his gaze fixed on the small, silver band that seemed to glow with an inner light on Elara's finger, a beacon in the dusty twilight. The wagon was provisionally fixed, but a new, far more perplexing mystery had just presented itself, glinting under the setting sun. The image solidified in Elias's mind with the force of a physical blow, making him gasp. The intertwined vines, the small, dark blue stone like a captured piece of midnight sky. He'd seen its twin, or one so like it as to be indistinguishable, many years ago, in a different place, under far different circumstances. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence that had fallen between him and the girl. He remembered a woman's hand, pale and trembling, clutching just such a ring as she wept over a freshly turned grave. He remembered hushed, angry whispers in a dimly lit tavern, tales of injustice, of land stolen, of a family driven out, their name all but erased. The McAllisters. That was the name. A family known for their skill with metal and wood, craftsmen of renown who had settled a fertile valley some 50 miles east of here, a place called Willow Creek. They had a distinctive family crest, a stylized design of intertwined willow branches, and rumor had it their women wore rings bearing a miniature version of that crest, passed down through generations. The ring Elara wore, it wasn't just similar, it had to be one of theirs. Elias sank back onto the rock, the strength momentarily leaving his legs. His own troubles, the broken wagon, the lost savings, seemed to recede, overshadowed by a dawning, horrifying suspicion. If that ring was a McAllister heirloom, what was it doing on the finger of this orphaned girl, here, so far from Willow Creek? The McAllisters had vanished years ago. Their prosperous farm had been taken over, swallowed by a powerful, ambitious man named Silas Blackwood, who had since risen to become one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the entire territory. Blackwood claimed he'd bought the land fair and square after the McAllisters had supposedly abandoned it, moving on to greener, unknown pastures. But there were always darker rumors, whispers that never quite died down, of intimidation, of forced sales, of outright theft. "Elara," he said, his voice raspy, "your mother, did she ever speak of a place called Willow Creek? Or the name McAllister?" Elara looked up, her blue eyes wide and searching his face. "Willow Creek," she repeated softly, a frown creasing her brow. "Yes. I think she did. She used to cry sometimes, and she'd whisper that name. And McAllister, that sounds familiar, like a dream I can't quite hold onto." She looked down at the ring again, her small fingers tracing its carved surface. "She said this ring was a key, a memory. She told me it would lead me home one day, if I was brave enough to follow." A cold dread, mixed with a rising tide of indignation, washed over Elias. A key. A memory. Lead her home. The pieces were falling into place with a terrible, sickening clarity. This child, this quiet, resilient girl who had just saved his wagon, was quite possibly the last scion of a dispossessed family, carrying the proof of her heritage on her very finger, entirely unaware of its true significance or the dangerous truth it represented. And he, Elias Thorne, a down-on-his-luck settler, was now privy to this secret, a secret that could unravel the carefully constructed legacy of a man as powerful and ruthless as Silas Blackwood. He thought of his own struggles, the weariness that had settled deep in his bones. He had come west seeking a fresh start, a small piece of land to call his own, a chance to build something honest. He was no hero, no crusader. But looking at Elara, at her innocent, earnest face, at the ancient ring that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, he felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a fierce, protective anger, and a reluctant sense of duty. He couldn't ignore this. He couldn't just thank the girl for fixing his wagon and send her on her way, knowing what he now suspected. The ring wasn't just an heirloom, it was a testament to a past injustice, a silent accusation. And Elara, whether she knew it or not, was at the very heart of it. His own journey had just taken a sharp, unexpected, and perilous turn. The broken wagon was a minor inconvenience compared to the fractured lives this ring hinted at. A fragile alliance began to form between the weary settler and the orphaned girl, born of a shared task and the dawning realization of a deeper, more complex connection. As the last light of day bled from the sky, painting the clouds in hues of purple and bruised orange, Elias knew he couldn't simply drive his mended wagon into Redemption Creek and forget about Elara and her ring. The knowledge he possessed, the memories it had stirred, were too potent, too charged with the scent of old injustice. "Elara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "your mother was right. That ring is important. More important than you can imagine." He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, how much a child could comprehend of such adult treachery. The McAllisters of Willow Creek, they were good people, skilled people. They built a beautiful farm there. But they lost it. Some say unjustly. Elara listened, her gaze fixed on his face, her expression solemn. "My mother never spoke much of how they lost their home," she admitted, her voice a near whisper. "Only that it was taken, and a great sadness followed. She always looked over her shoulder, like she was afraid of shadows." The word sent a chill down Elias's spine. Afraid of shadows. It fit the narrative of a family wronged, perhaps even threatened. "Silas Blackwood owns that land now," Elias stated, watching Elara's reaction. "He's a rich man. A powerful man in these parts." The name Blackwood clearly meant something to Elara. A flicker of unease crossed her face. "Mr. Blackwood, he comes to Redemption Creek sometimes. He owns the big mercantile, and the livery. Mama always told me to stay clear of him and his men. She said they had cold eyes." Cold eyes. Another chillingly accurate observation. Elias nodded slowly. "Your mother was wise, Elara." He took a deep breath. I think your ring might be proof of who you are, proof that the McAllister line didn't just vanish." A spark of understanding, mingled with fear and a dawning hope, lit Elara's eyes. "Proof? You mean Willow Creek could still be my home?" "Perhaps," Elias said cautiously. "But proving it, against a man like Blackwood, that would be a dangerous thing, Elara." Very dangerous. He looked at her small, determined face. She had shown courage and resourcefulness with his wagon. Did she possess the resilience for a fight like this? It was a heavy burden to even suggest to a child. "But if it's the truth," Elara said, her small chin lifting slightly, "shouldn't the truth be known? Mama always said truth was like the sun, it could be hidden by clouds for a while, but it always shines through in the end." Elias felt a lump in his throat. Such simple, profound wisdom from one so young. He had been adrift, lost in his own misfortunes, but Elara's quiet strength, her unwavering belief in the lessons her mother had taught her, was like a beacon. Perhaps, he thought, his own journey west wasn't just about finding land for himself. Perhaps he was meant to be here, at this moment, to help this child uncover a truth that had been buried for too long. "All right, Elara," he said, a new resolve hardening his voice. "All right. We'll be careful. We'll be smart. But we'll try to find out what really happened. We'll see if this ring can indeed lead you home." He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. The wagon, though crudely mended, looked like it would hold. First things first, we need to get this wagon into town before it's fully dark. And then, tomorrow, we start asking some very quiet questions. Ilara's face, illuminated by the rising moon, seemed to glow. A small smile touched her lips, a genuine smile this time, not of shyness, but of a burgeoning hope. She nodded, clutching the hand with the ring to her chest. The makeshift linchpin held as they slowly, carefully, guided the wagon along the rutted track towards the flickering lights of Redemption Creek. The journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And hanging in the air between the man and the child was the unspoken understanding that the small silver ring on Ilara's finger was now the compass guiding their improbable quest. The next morning, under a sky washed clean by the night, Redemption Creek buzzed with the low hum of early activity. Elias, having spent a restless night camped at the edge of town, his mind replaying the events of the previous day, sought out Ilara. He found her near the town well, where she often helped an elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, draw water in exchange for a warm breakfast and scraps of news. Mrs. Gable was known as the town's living memory, a woman whose sharp eyes had seen Redemption Creek grow from a handful of cabins to a bustling, if still rough-edged, settlement. Elias approached cautiously, nodding a polite greeting to Mrs. Gable, a woman with a kind, wrinkled face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He said, then turned to Ilara. Ready to talk a little, like we discussed? Ilara nodded, her expression serious. Mrs. Gable, her hand still on the rope of the well bucket, looked from Elias to Ilara, a knowing glint in her gaze. This one, she said, patting Ilara's shoulder, has an old soul. And a good heart. You be good to her, mister. I intend to, Elias replied earnestly. In fact, we were hoping you might be able to help us with something. A matter of history, you might say. Mrs. Gable's eyebrows rose. History, is it? Well, I've got plenty of that stored away. She gestured towards a nearby bench under the shade of a struggling cottonwood tree. Spit it out, then. My ears are open, though my legs ain't what they used to be. As Elias and Ilara settled on the bench, Elias began, carefully choosing his words. He spoke of Ilara's mother, and the ring, and the faint memories of a place called Willow Creek, and the name McAllister. He didn't mention Silas Blackwood directly at first, wanting to gauge Mrs. Gable's initial reaction. At the mention of McAllister and Willow Creek, Mrs. Gable's expression changed. A shadow passed over her kindly features, and her eyes, usually bright with curiosity, narrowed thoughtfully. McAllister? She murmured, her voice taking on a distant tone. I remember the McAllisters. Fine folk they were. True artisans. Thomas McAllister, the father, could make wood sing and iron bend to his will like it was soft clay. And his wife, Lyra, she had a gentleness about her, but a strong spirit. They had a little girl. Sarah, I think her name was. Would be about your mother's age, Ilara, if she'd lived. Ilara leaned forward, her breath catching. My mother's name was Sarah, she whispered. Mrs. Gable's gaze sharpened, focusing intently on Ilara. Is that a fact? She looked at the ring on Ilara's finger, which Elias subtly indicated. The old woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Saints preserve us, she breathed. That design. I've not seen its like in many a year. Lyra McAllister wore such a ring. Said it was her grandmother's, and her grandmother's before that. A family mark, it was. The pieces were slotting together, forming a clearer, more painful picture. What happened to them, Mrs. Gable? Elias asked quietly. The stories are vague. A sigh escaped Mrs. Gable's lips, heavy with old sorrow. Vague for a reason, mister. Some truths are dangerous to speak aloud in these parts. The McAllisters didn't just move on, like some would have you believe. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. They were hounded out. That land, Willow Creek, it's the most fertile stretch in this whole territory. Someone wanted it badly. Someone with power, and no conscience to speak of. Silas Blackwood, Elias stated, no longer a question. Mrs. Gable nodded grimly. He came to town with pockets full of gold and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. made offers for land, and if folks refused, well, accidents started happening. Fences cut, livestock poisoned, wells fouled. The McAllisters were stubborn. They loved their home. Thomas McAllister, he stood up to Blackwood. Publicly. Said he'd never sell. Her voice trembled slightly. Not long after, there was a fire. A terrible fire at the McAllister farm. Thomas didn't make it out. Lyra and little Sarah, they vanished in the night. Most assumed they perished too, or fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs, too terrified to ever return. Blackwood expressed his deepest sympathies, of course. And then, quiet-like, he took over the land. Said he was improving it. Ilara was pale, her small hand clutching her ring so tightly her knuckles were white. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't make a sound. Elias put a comforting arm around her shoulders. The brutality of it, the calculated cruelty, filled him with a cold rage. So, Ilara's mother, Sarah, she survived, Elias murmured, piecing it together. She must have lived in fear, always hiding, always protecting her daughter and that ring. It would seem so, Mrs. Gable affirmed, her eyes full of pity for Ilara. And if that ring is what I think it is, and you are who I think you are, child. She looked directly at Ilara. Then Silas Blackwood has a secret he'd kill to keep buried. Her words hung heavy in the morning air. Just then, a shadow fell over them. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dusty duster coat, a holstered gun prominent on his hip, had approached unheard. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, swept over the trio. It was Jedediah Croft, Blackwood's notorious foreman, a man whose reputation for unpleasantness preceded him. Mrs. Gable, Croft drawled, his voice like gravel. Filling folks' heads with your old wives' tales again. His gaze lingered on Elias, then on Ilara, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. New in town, are you, mister? Best be careful what stories you listen to. Some folks around here don't take kindly to stirring up old dust. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more threat than courtesy, and sauntered off towards the mercantile, Blackwood's mercantile. The warning was unmistakable. The investigation had barely begun, and already danger was making its presence known. The encounter with Croft cast a pall over their efforts, but it also solidified their resolve. Mrs. Gable, her initial caution replaced by a fierce loyalty to what she now believed was the truth of Ilara's heritage, became their stanchest, if most discreet, ally. Blackwood's got ears everywhere, she warned them later that day, her voice hushed as they gathered in her small, tidy cabin behind the well. Croft's sighting of you talking to me will already be back to him. We need to be smarter than his malice. She suggested they search for any old records that might have survived from the time of the McAllisters. The old church, St. Michael's, used to keep a parish register, births, deaths, marriages. Father Michael, the priest back then, he was a stickler for detail. If anyone recorded anything about the McAllisters, it would have been him. The church is mostly derelict now, up on Whisperwind Hill, but the records might still be there if they weren't destroyed. Whisperwind Hill. The name itself sounded desolate. Elias knew the place, it overlooked the valley, and the crumbling stone structure of St. Michael's was a stark silhouette against the skyline, a place most townsfolk avoided, believing it haunted. Perfect for a secret search. Under the cover of a moonless night, Elias and Ilara made their way up the winding path to the old church. Ilara, despite the eerie surroundings and the weight of their mission, showed no fear, only a quiet determination that mirrored Elias's own. Mrs. Gable had given Ilara a small, sputtering lantern, its light casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the gnarled trees that clawed at the path. The church was even more dilapidated up close. The roof had partially collapsed in one section, and the wind, true to the hill's name, whistled through broken stained glass windows, creating mournful, sighing sounds. Inside, dust lay thick as a shroud over everything. Pews were overturned, and debris littered the stone floor. It felt like intruding on a forgotten tomb. Father Michael's study was through there, Ilara whispered, pointing to a small, warped door at the side of the altar, her voice barely audible above the wind. Mrs. Gable had described the church's layout meticulously. The door creaked open with a sound that made them both jump. The study was small, cramped, and even more chaotic than the main church. Books, their pages swollen and mildewed, were scattered everywhere. A simple wooden desk stood in one corner, its surface covered in dust and mouse droppings. It seemed a hopeless task. "We're looking for a leather-bound ledger," Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Dark brown, maybe with a simple cross embossed on the cover." They began to search, carefully moving aside debris, sifting through piles of decaying paper. Elara, with her small stature, was able to squeeze into tight corners that Elias couldn't reach. Her fingers, surprisingly adept, gently turned brittle pages, her eye scanning for any mention of the McAllister name. Hours seemed to pass. The lantern light flickered, threatening to die. Despair began to creep in, cold and insidious as the damp air of the church. Then, Elara let out a small gasp. "Elias! Look!" She was crouched beside a toppled bookshelf, pulling at something wedged beneath it. It was a heavy, leather-bound book, its cover stained and warped, but undeniably the ledger Mrs. Gable had described. A simple, faded gold cross was just visible beneath the grime. With trembling hands, Elias helped her pull it free. They carried it to the rickety desk and, by the guttering light of the lantern, carefully opened it. The ink on the pages was faded, the script old-fashioned, but legible. Page after page of births, baptisms, marriages, deaths, names of people long gone, their lives briefly recorded by Father Michael's diligent hand. Elara, her finger tracing the lines, suddenly stopped. "Here," she breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. McAllister. There it was. An entry for Thomas McAllister, and his wife, Lyra. And then, another entry, a baptism, Sarah Elara McAllister, daughter of Thomas and Lyra McAllister, born this year of our Lord. Following the entry for Sarah's baptism, Father Michael had made a notation, something highly unusual for such a formal register. In spidery, hurried script, he had written, "Presented at baptism with the ancestral McAllister ring, silver with intertwined willow branches and lapis lazuli, a mark of her lineage." Elias stared at the words, his heart pounding. Lapis lazuli. That deep blue stone. Intertwined willow branches. It was an exact description of the ring Elara wore. This was it. This was the undeniable link, recorded by an impartial hand years ago, long before Blackwood's reign of greed began. This ledger, this forgotten book in a ruined church, was a crucial piece of evidence. It corroborated Elara's claim, tied her directly to the McAllister name and, by extension, to Willow Creek. But as they savored their discovery, a floorboard creaked near the main entrance to the church. Elias doused the lantern instantly, plunging them into near-total darkness. They froze, listening, their breath held tight. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the debris in the nave. Someone else was in the church. Someone who was not supposed to be there. The wind howled outside, a fitting soundtrack to the sudden, terrifying realization that their secret search might not have been so secret after all. The hunt for truth had just become a desperate game of survival. The footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate, echoing ominously in the cavernous space of the ruined church. Elias motioned urgently for Elara to hide, pushing her gently towards the dark recess behind the overturned altar, a space barely large enough for her small form. He pressed the heavy ledger into her hands. "Keep this safe, no matter what," he whispered, his voice tight. "Don't make a sound," Elara nodded, her eyes wide but resolute in the darkness, clutching the precious book to her chest. Elias flattened himself against the cold stone wall of the chancel, his hand gripping the worn handle of his pistol, its cold weight a grim comfort. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the intruder's location. The footsteps paused, then resumed, moving towards the small study where they had been just moments before. A sliver of moonlight, breaking through a gap in the clouds, momentarily illuminated the figure stepping through the study doorway. It was Jedediah Croft, Blackwood's foreman, his face set in a grim sneer, a lantern held aloft in one hand, a heavy riding crop in the other. "Thought I heard my skittering around up here," Croft drawled, his voice amplified by the church's acoustics. Or maybe just rats, stirring up things best left buried. His gaze swept the small, disordered room, lingering on the disturbed books, the faint scent of their recently extinguished lantern. He knew they'd been there. Elias's mind raced. Croft wasn't alone. He could hear the faint jingle of harness and the snort of a horse from outside the church, likely another of Blackwood's men waiting. A direct confrontation was out of the question, especially with Ilara to protect. They needed to escape, but Croft blocked the only clear exit from the study. Croft took a step further into the study, his lantern casting grotesque, dancing shadows. He kicked at a pile of discarded papers. "Wasting your time, whoever you are. Some histories are best left unwritten." Mr. Blackwood sees to that. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed a loose shutter against a window frame with a loud bang, startling Croft. He spun around, his lantern light wavering. In that brief moment of distraction, Elias saw his chance. He darted from his hiding place, not towards the study exit, but towards the far side of the chancel, where a section of the wall had crumbled, offering a potential, if perilous, escape route down the steep, overgrown hillside behind the church. "There you are," Croft snarled, spotting the movement. He lunged out of the study, abandoning any pretense of searching. "You won't get far." Elias scrambled towards the gap in the wall, shouting back, "Looking for something, Croft? Or just enjoying the midnight air?" He hoped to draw Croft's attention fully onto himself, giving Ilara a chance to remain hidden or slip away. Croft charged, faster than Elias had anticipated. Elias reached the crumbling opening just as Croft swung the riding crop. The lash whistled past his ear, striking the stone with a sharp crack. Elias didn't hesitate. He threw himself through the gap, tumbling down a short, sharp incline of loose earth and scree, landing heavily but managing to stay on his feet. "After him!" Croft bellowed to his companion outside. "Don't let him get away." Elias could hear the other man scrambling to follow. He pushed himself up, ignoring the scrapes and bruises, and plunged into the dense undergrowth that covered the hillside, heading away from the main path. He had to lead them away from Ilara, away from the church and the precious ledger. Meanwhile, back in the church, Ilara, hidden behind the altar, heard the commotion. She heard Elias's shout, Croft's angry response, and the sounds of pursuit fading down the hillside. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped bird. She knew Elias was trying to protect her, to protect the ledger. She clutched it tighter. She had to get out, but Croft might return, or the other man. Then she remembered something Mrs. Gable had told her about the old church. "There's an old priest's door, hidden behind the tapestry in the sacristy," the old woman had said. "Leads out to the old cemetery. Father Michael used it when he wanted some peace, or when unwelcome visitors came to the front." The sacristy. It was a small room off the chancel, near where she was hiding. Taking a deep breath, Ilara slipped from her hiding place. The main body of the church was empty now, Croft and his man presumably chasing Elias. Moving like a shadow, she crept into the sacristy. A faded, moth-eaten tapestry hung on one wall. With trembling fingers, she pulled it aside. There, almost invisible against the stone, was the outline of a small, narrow door. It had no visible handle, just a small, cleverly disguised indentation. She pressed it, and with a faint click, the door swung inward silently, revealing a dark, narrow passage. Clutching the ledger, Ilara slipped through the opening and pulled the hidden door shut behind her. The passage was short, leading her out into the overgrown, moon-dappled cemetery, filled with leaning, weathered headstones. She didn't pause. She knew she had to get back to Mrs. Gable, to safety. The ledger was their proof, their hope. As she hurried through the long grass, the sounds of the pursuit on the other side of the hill seemed to fade, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of her own young heart. She had escaped, and the truth, bound in old leather, was still safe in her hands. The stakes had been raised terrifyingly high. Blackwood was clearly aware of their inquiries, and he was prepared to use force to stop them. Elias managed to lose his pursuers in the dense, unfamiliar woods that skirted Whisperwind Hill. He doubled back eventually, bruised and scratched but otherwise unharmed, his mind consumed with worry for Ilara. He approached Mrs. Gable's cabin with extreme caution, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave when he saw a faint light in her window. He tapped a prearranged signal on the door. It opened a crack, and Mrs. Gable's anxious face appeared. "Elias! Thank the heavens! Ilara is here. She's safe." He stumbled inside, his body aching, to find Ilara sitting at the small table, the precious ledger open before her. She looked up, her eyes wide with concern for him, but also shining with a determined light. "You were right, Elias," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Croft, he knew. He was looking for us." "Blackwood sent him," Elias said grimly, sinking onto a stool. "He knows we're getting close to something he wants to keep buried." He looked at the ledger, at the spidery script detailing Ilara's baptism and the description of the ring. "This changes things. This isn't just hearsay or old memories anymore. This is tangible proof." Mrs. Gable nodded, her expression stern. "Silas Blackwood is a dangerous man, more dangerous now that he feels threatened. He won't stop with just a chase in the dark. He'll try to discredit you, Elias. Run you out of town. And Ilara?" Her voice softened with concern. "He'll try to silence her, one way or another. That ring, and now this ledger, they are a direct threat to everything he's built on lies." A heavy silence filled the small cabin. The weight of their situation pressed down on them. They had the truth, but the truth was a perilous weapon against a man who controlled so much of Redemption Creek, its commerce, its law, its fear. "What do we do?" Ilara asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. "We can't just hide this, can we?" Elias looked at her, at the courage that burned so brightly in her young eyes. She was right. They hadn't come this far, risked this much, to cower in the shadows. "No, Ilara," he said slowly, a plan beginning to form in his mind, desperate and audacious though it was. "We don't hide it. We bring it into the light. Blackwood thrives in darkness and secrets. We need to find a way to expose him publicly, where his power and intimidation won't be as effective." "But how?" Mrs. Gable interjected, her brow furrowed with worry. "He controls the town council. The sheriff is in his pocket. Any official channels are closed to us." Elias's gaze fell upon a handle tacked to Mrs. Gable's wall, an announcement for the upcoming Redemption Creek Founders' Day celebration, scheduled for the end of the week. Silas Blackwood's name was prominently featured as the main benefactor and keynote speaker. An idea, bold and risky, began to take shape. "Founders' Day," Elias mused aloud. "Blackwood will be there, preening in front of the whole town, talking about his contributions, his vision." He looked from Mrs. Gable to Ilara. What if the town heard a different story that day? What if they heard the truth about the real founders of Willow Creek's prosperity, the McAllisters? What if they saw the proof with their own eyes? Mrs. Gable gasped. "You mean to confront him? Publicly? At the celebration?" "It's our best chance," Elias argued, a spark of desperate energy igniting within him. "He won't expect it. In front of everyone, his usual tactics of threats and violence will be harder to employ. If we can present the evidence clearly, compellingly, if Ilara can tell her story." Ilara straightened her small shoulders. "I can," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I can tell them about my mother, and my grandfather. I can show them the ring, and the ledger. It's the truth." The plan was fraught with danger. Blackwood would be furious, his response unpredictable. But it was also their only real opportunity to bypass his network of control and appeal directly to the conscience of the townspeople, many of whom had their own quiet grievances against Blackwood's heavy-handed influence. Over the next few days, they prepared in secret. Mrs. Gable, using her network of old friends and acquaintances who harbored no love for Blackwood, discreetly spread whispers, not of the specifics, but of a long-hidden truth that might soon come to light, piquing curiosity and ensuring a larger, more attentive crowd at the Founders' Day celebration. Elias, meanwhile, worked with Ilara, helping her articulate her family's story, ensuring she understood the details in the ledger. He also made a discreet copy of the crucial page in the ledger, hiding the original in a secure location Mrs. Gable knew. The ring Elara wore became their potent symbol, a tangible link to a stolen past. Blackwood, sensing something was amiss but unable to pinpoint it, grew more agitated. Croft and his men were more visible around town, their expressions uglier than usual. Elias received a direct, menacing visit from Croft himself. "Heard you've been asking a lot of questions, Thorn," Croft had sneered, blocking Elias's path near the livery. "Mr. Blackwood is a generous man to his friends, but he don't tolerate troublemakers. Redemption Creek is a peaceful town. We aim to keep it that way. Maybe it's time you moved on. There's good land further west, I hear. Real good land. Mr. Blackwood might even help you get a stake in it, if you was to leave." Quietly, the offer was clear, a bribe wrapped in a threat. Elias met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate the advice, Croft," he said, his voice calm. "But I'm finding Redemption Creek rather interesting. I think I'll stay a while." Croft's eyes narrowed, and he spat on the ground before turning away. The lines had been drawn. The confrontation was inevitable. The quiet determination of a little girl with a silver ring was about to challenge the foundations of a powerful man's empire of deceit. The morning of Redemption Creek's Founders' Day dawned bright and clear, a perfect sky belying the storm of confrontation brewing below. The town square was festooned with colorful, if somewhat ragged, bunting. A makeshift wooden platform had been erected, draped with a banner proclaiming progress and prosperity, thanks to Silas Blackwood. Tables laden with food and drink, sponsored by Blackwood's Mercantile, were being set up. The townsfolk gathered, a mixture of genuine festive spirit, cautious curiosity fueled by Mrs. Gable's whispers, and the underlying tension that always seemed to simmer beneath the surface in a town dominated by one man's will. Silas Blackwood himself arrived in a polished black buggy, his tailored suit immaculate, a self-satisfied smile fixed on his face. He was a man in his prime, imposing and confident, radiating an aura of wealth and authority. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, patting children on the head, the benevolent patriarch playing his role to perfection. His foreman, Jedediah Croft, and a few other grim-faced men hovered nearby, watchful and alert. Elias and Elara stood at the edge of the square, near Mrs. Gable, who offered them a reassuring nod. Elara clutched a small, carefully wrapped parcel containing the copied page from the ledger and a magnifying glass Elias had procured. The original ring, a silent testament, glinted on her finger. She was pale but composed, her small hand gripping Elias's tightly. He squeezed it gently. "Remember what we talked about," he murmured. "Speak from your heart. The truth is on your side." The town sheriff, a portly man named Dawkins who owed his position entirely to Blackwood, droned through a series of opening remarks, extolling the virtues of their town and its foremost citizen. Then, with a flourish, he introduced Silas Blackwood. Applause, somewhat muted and hesitant from certain sections of the crowd, rippled through the square. Blackwood ascended the platform, beaming. He launched into a grandiloquent speech about his vision, his investments, his tireless efforts to drag Redemption Creek from a dusty outpost into a thriving hub of commerce. He spoke of opportunity, of hard work, of the bright future he was building for them all. It was a masterful performance, full of empty platitudes and self-congratulation. As he paused for dramatic effect, preparing for his concluding remarks, Elias knew it was time. "Now, Elara," he whispered. Taking a deep breath, Elara stepped forward, followed closely by Elias. They walked directly towards the platform. A murmur ran through the crowd. Croft, spotting them, started forward, his face contorting in a snarl, but he was too far away to intercept them immediately. "Mr. Blackwood!" Elias called out, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the expectant silence. "Before you conclude, there is another story of founding this town ought to hear. A story of true pioneers, and of a legacy stolen." Blackwood, momentarily stunned by the interruption, frowned, his eyes like chips of ice. "What is the meaning of this, Thorn? This is highly inappropriate. Sheriff, remove this man." Sheriff Dawkins, flustered, started to move, but the crowd, intrigued and sensing drama, pressed closer, blocking his path. "We mean no disrespect to the genuine efforts of this town's people, Mr. Blackwood," Elias continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "But your narrative of prosperity conveniently omits its true origins. It omits the name McAllister." At the mention of McAllister, a deeper hush fell over the crowd. Older faces registered recognition, surprise, and a dawning understanding. Blackwood's smile faltered, replaced by a fleeting look of fury before his mask of composure slipped back into place. "McAllister," he scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand. "An old name, irrelevant. They abandoned their claim years ago. I purchased the land legally and fairly." "Did you, Mr. Blackwood?" Ilara's voice, though small, carried with surprising clarity in the sudden stillness. She stepped onto the edge of the platform, holding up her hand, the silver ring flashing in the sunlight. "My name is Ilara McAllister. My mother was Sarah McAllister, and her father was Thomas McAllister. This was his land. This was his ring, passed down through generations, a mark of our family, who settled Willow Creek and made it flourish long before you came." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes were on the small girl and the ring she displayed. Blackwood's face darkened. "This is preposterous. A child's fantasy, no doubt coached by this troublemaker." He jabbed a finger at Elias. "She has no proof." "Oh, but she does, Mr. Blackwood," Elias countered calmly. He gestured to the parcel Ilara held. "Ilara, show them." With steady hands, Ilara unwrapped the copied page from Father Michael's ledger and the magnifying glass. "This is from the St. Michael's Church Register," she announced, her voice gaining strength. "It records the baptism of my mother, Sarah Ilara McAllister. And it describes this very ring, silver with intertwined willow branches and lapis lazuli, a mark of her lineage, given to her then." She held up the magnifying glass over the ring, then over the script on the page, inviting those closest to the platform to see. Several respected elders of the town, including the local school teacher and the doctor, pressed forward, peering intently. They looked from the ring to the ancient script, their expressions growing grave. "The handwriting is indeed Father Michael's," the school teacher, a prim woman known for her integrity, declared, her voice carrying authority. "And the description matches the ring perfectly." Blackwood was visibly shaken now, his composure cracking. "This is a forgery. A trick. These people are liars, trying to extort me." "Then perhaps you can explain the fire, Mr. Blackwood." Elias pressed, his voice like steel. "The fire that killed Thomas McAllister after he publicly refused to sell you his land? The fire that forced his wife and young daughter to flee in terror, to live lives of fear and hiding, until Sarah, Ilara's mother, died, leaving her daughter an orphan with nothing but this ring and the fragmented memories of a stolen heritage." The crowd was in an uproar now, angry shouts directed at Blackwood mixing with murmurs of sympathy for Ilara. Croft and his men tried to push forward, but the townsfolk, emboldened by the revelations and their sheer numbers, stood their ground, forming a protective circle around Ilara and Elias. Ilara stood tall, her small face etched with a sorrowful dignity. "My mother never forgot Willow Creek," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "She told me this ring would lead me home. She told me truth, like the sun, always shines through. All I ask is for the truth to be acknowledged. For my family's name to be cleared, and their memory honored." She looked directly at Blackwood, her innocent gaze a powerful indictment. "You built your prosperity on my family's ashes and tears, Mr. Blackwood. That is not true founding. That is theft." The accusation hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Blackwood, his face a mask of rage and desperation, opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He was exposed, his carefully crafted facade shattered by the irrefutable testimony of a child's ring and a forgotten ledger. The power he had wielded through fear and manipulation seemed to evaporate under the collective gaze of the community he had sought to control. The sun, indeed, was beginning to shine through the clouds of deceit. The impact of Ilara's words, combined with the tangible evidence of the ring and the ledger, was devastating to Silas Blackwood's carefully cultivated image. His blustering denial sounded hollow against the quiet dignity of the child and the murmurs of assent from respected community members who had verified the ledger's authenticity. Sheriff Dawkins, seeing the tide turn so dramatically against his patron, made a weak attempt to disperse the crowd, but he was largely ignored, his authority vanishing like mist in the morning sun. Mrs. Gable, her eyes shining, stepped forward. "I remember Lyra McAllister and little Sarah," she declared, her voice, though aged, ringing with conviction. "And I remember the fear after Thomas McAllister died and Blackwood took the land. This child speaks the truth. The McAllisters were the true heart of Willow Creek." Others in the crowd, emboldened, began to voice their own long-suppressed grievances against Blackwood: unfair business practices, intimidation tactics, lands acquired under dubious circumstances. It was as if a dam of fear had broken, and years of resentment poured forth. Blackwood, for the first time in his arrogant life, looked truly afraid, his face pale, his eyes darting around for an escape that wasn't there. Jedediah Croft and his men, outnumbered and facing a hostile populace, hesitated, their usual menace deflated. In the ensuing chaos, a circuit judge, a stern, upright man named Josiah Pendleton, who happened to be visiting Redemption Creek from a larger territorial capital and had been observing the Founders' Day proceedings with a detached interest, stepped onto the platform. His presence commanded immediate attention. "These are grave accusations," Judge Pendleton announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "And this evidence," he gestured towards Ilara's ring and the ledger copy, which the schoolteacher had handed to him, "appears compelling. I will be impounding this document and taking statements. An immediate and thorough investigation into Mr. Blackwood's acquisition of the Willow Creek property, and indeed his other dealings, will commence forthwith." He looked directly at Blackwood, his expression uncompromising. "Mr. Blackwood, you will remain in Redemption Creek and make yourself available to my inquiries. Any attempt to leave or interfere will be met with the full force of the law." Blackwood sputtered, but the fight had gone out of him. He was surrounded, exposed, his power unraveling before his very eyes. The crowd, sensing justice was finally within reach, roared its approval. Ilara, exhausted but relieved, leaned against Elias, a tentative smile gracing her lips. The silver ring on her finger seemed to gleam with a renewed brilliance, no longer just a memento of loss, but a beacon of truth vindicated. The downfall of Silas Blackwood was swift and decisive. Judge Pendleton's investigation unearthed a damning trail of deceit, coercion, and outright fraud. The original church ledger, retrieved from its hiding place, became a cornerstone of the case. Faced with irrefutable evidence and numerous testimonies from emboldened townsfolk, Blackwood's empire crumbled. His properties were seized pending legal review, his cronies scattered, and he himself faced multiple charges. The fear he had instilled in Redemption Creek began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope and empowerment. For Ilara, justice meant the restoration of her heritage. The Willow Creek farm, though changed by years of Blackwood's ownership, was legally recognized as belonging to the McAllister estate, with Ilara as the sole heir. It was a daunting prospect for a young girl, but she was not alone. Elias, his own plans for settling temporarily deferred, vowed to help her. Many in Redemption Creek, moved by her courage and ashamed of their previous silence, offered their support, tools, and labor to help restore the farm to its former glory. Epilogue, 5 years later. The sun cast a warm, golden glow over the thriving fields of Willow Creek Farm. The farmhouse, once neglected, now stood proud and welcoming, its windowsills bright with flowers. The intertwined willow branches of the McAllister crest, newly carved by a grateful craftsman from Redemption Creek, adorned the gate. Ilara, now a young woman of 15, stood on the porch, her gaze sweeping over the land that was her birthright. The silver ring, still on her finger, was a constant reminder of her journey, of loss and discovery, of courage and the enduring power of truth. She was no longer the timid, overlooked orphan, but a respected and beloved figure in the community, known for her wisdom, her kindness, and her deep connection to the land. Elias Thorne had found his place too. He had established his own modest farm on a neighboring plot, a gift from a grateful Ilara and the town council, which was now run by honest, elected members. He remained Ilara's closest friend, advisor, and protector, a surrogate father figure who had helped her navigate the complexities of her new life. He often visited Willow Creek, and they would sit on the porch, much like now, watching the land flourish. Redemption Creek itself had transformed. With Blackwood's oppressive influence gone, a new spirit of cooperation and fairness had taken root. The town was genuinely prospering, built on honest labor and mutual respect rather than fear and exploitation. Mrs. Gable, now frail but still sharp as ever, often told the story of Founder's Day, of how a little girl with a ring and a weary settler had dared to speak truth to power, inspiring a whole town to reclaim its soul. Elara smiled, touching the ring. Her mother's words echoed in her memory, "It will lead you home one day, if you are brave enough to follow." She had been brave, and she had found her home. More than that, she had helped an entire community find its own redemption. The ring was more than just silver and stone, it was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fact that even the smallest voice, armed with truth, can change the world, and that justice, though sometimes long delayed, can ultimately prevail, shining as brightly and as surely as the sun over Willow Creek.